If not there, Dan here, aka the Comic Concierge, coming from a bit of a different location for this week as I'm doing this video. I've had some tech issues as of late, so I'm trying to get those addressed, but I wanted to do this video with some recent news regarding Spider-Man, and I do apologize if there's some sound issues with this video as my microphone also decided it wanted to die, but I appreciate if you bear with me because I think generally hopefully the general content will be good enough for you to get over those. So I do want to give that warning ahead of time just in case that does come up. Those that don't know, it's recently announced that Nick Spencer will no longer be doing Spider-Man shortly, and they'll be replacing him with a new writer, a new creative team, one would assume. So I thought, why not put a video out there and talk about who are some people that I think would be good choices for taking up Spider-Man. Also talk about some of the names that I see people tossing out there as likely candidates to take over the title and explain why I think some of those candidates probably won't, even if they would be good candidates. Some of the candidates I think are the most likely to take over Spider-Man and how I think they would do in that role. And then lastly, some choices I have that maybe out of the box a bit, maybe extremely unlikely to happen, but give you some reasons why I think it would be a cool choice. I do worry about doing this a little bit because similar to like fan casting, I feel like it's just an exercise in typecasting sometimes, basically saying, hey, you did this before that's similar, that means you can do this again in this new format. And then someone who maybe hasn't had the opportunity or hasn't done a style that would be similar to Spider-Man is left out of the conversation. We put people in a box that we're comfortable with, and then we just assume they can't get out of that box. You know, for example, who knew that Al Ewing and Joe Bennett would be able to give us Immortal Hulk like they did? They weren't necessarily creators that people were like, yeah, they could write one of the best Marvel runs of this era, and that happened. So again, these are just some thoughts and opinions. So I'm sure there's a lot of people that would agree or disagree with my takes or have different people out there, but it's just some of the names I'm hearing a lot of people talk about as of late. Some of the big names people kind of bring up and explain why I don't think just logistically those names are gonna work, considering the fact that Spider-Man is a title that does release twice a month, if not more, and then at times weekly. So it's a huge time commitment. I think that's going to stop a lot of people from even attempting to take over the book unless they can completely change the model, which I don't necessarily think they would. Was it Nick Spencer who wanted to do all those weekly series, or was it Marvel? Was it editorial? Was it both? I'm not sure, but ultimately I don't see them changing it that drastically. So this is going to be a time crunch. If you're writing Spider-Man, that pretty much means that that'll be the main thing you will be writing, considering how much they put into that character being probably arguably Marvel's most popular character in general. So let's start with the first name I'm hearing a lot of people bring up, and I get why, and it's Tom Taylor. Anytime we have an opening like this, Batman, Superman, Tom Taylor's name is right there as people who want to take over the character. It also helped that Tom Taylor was announcing Marvel news the same day that there was going to be this Spider-Man switchover, which I think they kind of coincided with one another. I do not think Tom Taylor would take over Spider-Man. The big reason why, again, is that time commitment. Just look at the fact that he is Nightwing. He's taking over Superman for DC. Marvel is not going to want the Spider-Man writer working for DC, not necessarily because of the competition per se, but just, again, the time commitment. Like, they don't want to put the time and effort into bringing up this writer that's also going to, in the long run, bring up another title that they have nothing to do with. So I don't see them doing that. Plus, Tom Taylor has a lot of indie series he's working on, like Seven Secrets. He also has the animated series, The Deep, that he works on. That's also a comic as well. He has his hands in a lot of pots, and it seems like to be like what he likes to do. He doesn't like to be burdened with these long runs. He has this Batman Detective, for example, and I think that type of style would not make him conducive to writing Spider-Man. On top of that, you do have the Dark Ages book for Marvel he's writing. However, Tom Taylor has written Spider-Man before. He's written Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man a few years ago, and it was a title that was really overlooked, unfortunately. And I do advise checking that book out, especially the Spider-Bite storyline, that issue. You can read that by itself. It's a fantastic self-contained issue. It's very emotionally packed. And if anything, it's going to make you want to have Tom Taylor write more Spider-Man. But if you want to see that, no, he did write that title. It was really overlooked. I don't know why. Maybe because Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man does not have the same cachet as Amazing Spider-Man. I don't know, but I would highly advise checking that run out. It really ended too soon. Another big name I see people bring up is Donny Cates, and I get why, right? He was doing Venom, and that was huge. It would make sense to go to Venom to Spider-Man, but we also know that Donny Cates will be writing Hulk, and he has Thor. And if you read Venom 200, it does seem like his attention may be going to other universes without spoiling that issue. So again, that has me thinking that although he mainly works for Marvel, he does have some of his independent work like crossover. I do not think that they're going to put their Hulk writer and Spider-Man writer, considering that his notions might be elsewhere. I wouldn't be against it. I would like to see a Donny Cates' Spider-Man run. He's worked with the character a little bit, of course, writing Venom and King in Black. He's worked with both Miles Morales and Peter Parker. He also had a really great Spider-Man scene in his Doctor Strange run that was drawn by Chip Zdarsky. It's a fun little issue. I'd advise checking that out as well. But again, I just think, you're putting all this time into the Hulk. Would you really want him to do both of those at the same time? And in the case of that Thor, which does seem like that is a storyline that is still building up into something bigger. It could happen. I do think it's a little less likely, because if we're to believe what's in Venom 200, it would make me think that, again, his attention is going to be into other titles moving forward. Another big name, considering that he just rewrote the world of X-Men and kind of continuing doing that, is one of Jonathan Hickman. Hickman is a style that some people love, some people don't like. It's very hefty, but he's written a lot of Marvel titles, Avengers, Fantastic Four, and of course he has a current X-Men line, although the main X-Men book, or one of the X-Men books, is taken over by Jerry Dugan. So does that leave the door open for him to take over a character like Spider-Man? Perhaps, but I don't think it's going to happen. Now, I do think Jonathan Hickman as a writer is often a lot more funny. He has a lot more humor to his style than people give him credit for. It's not like the thing people know him for, but he is capable of running funny dialogue. It's not necessarily as quippy as something like Spider-Man, but I think he would definitely bring something into the new status quo for the character. But considering he has an entire world of X-Men he's working on, even if he's not writing all these different titles, would I love to see Marvel do what they did for X-Men with Spider-Man in the sense of reinvent his world in some way, reestablish him, try to kind of break away from the same old that they're doing with X-Men, love it or hate it. They're at least not just trying to relive storylines in the past. I would be for that, but how exactly do you do that with a character like Spider-Man? I'm not sure. But let's get into some writers that I think are a little more likely to take over the character and explain why that is, and how do I think they would handle the character. Let's start with Al Ewing, who is probably one of the most respected writers in Marvel right now with what he's doing with Immortal Hulk. And yes, he does have Venom that he's going to be working on or co-writing with Graham V. He also has the Gamma Flight, but he's also co-writing that as well. So that just has me think that maybe he's swinging himself up so he can have his hands in different pots, but also have writers that he can kind of bank on or work with and take over a character like Spider-Man. Again, is Al Ewing a type of writer that you think good old quips and humor and things like that? Maybe. I mean, his Guardians of the Galaxy run currently has that. It's not as acclaimed as Immortal Hulk. Immortal Hulk is ending, and I would love, actually, if they looked at what Joe Bennett and Al Ewing did with Immortal Hulk, and it's like, let's replicate that. Let's just take that team of Immortal Hulk and put him on Spider-Man. Of course, you're not going to have a horror-like book like you would for Spider-Man. Maybe you would. Maybe you would make it a horror book or have that type of appeal or something like that. But Al Ewing is much more than a horror writer. We've seen him work on a lot of science fiction stuff. His Ultimate series, of course, You Only Find Them When You're Dead as well. So he is a very versatile writer. But I think what one of the strengths of Immortal Hulk was the fact that you had a consistent creative team throughout. You had a few fill-in artists here and there, but mostly it was Joe Bennett and Al Ewing writing in the entire thing. And Joe Bennett was able to keep up with a pretty packed schedule. Like Immortal Hulk shipped, almost twice a week. It had a weird schedule. Sometimes I felt like it would come out weekly, and sometimes it was like a month apart. But Joe Bennett was able to keep up with that type of schedule. So maybe he could have something similar to that, because when it comes to Spider-Man, you can't have Spider-Man be late. It's often one of the best-selling books at shops, one of the best Marvel books. So you have to make sure that you have people that can hit schedules. And it seemed like that was a team that can maintain that. It's not just about how talented you are. It's a big piece is like, how good are you at hitting deadlines? And it seems the fact that Immortal Hulk has never been late, despite, nearing 50 issues, would make me think that they're all really good at that. So, I think style-wise, Al Ewing could do it. He wouldn't be my first choice, but if I heard he was taking over, it'd be like, okay, I could see that. Let's see how it goes. Another big writer, another name I see a lot of people bring up is Chip Zdarsky. And the fact that, he has a lot of Marvel books right now. He's also kind of testing the waters with DC a bit here and there, mostly writing in some of their anthology books. But when you think humor, you do think Chip Zdarsky. I mean, he has that type of personality when he's on Twitter or social media, when he's interviewed. And he's worked with Spider-Man in the past. He had his own Spider-Man Peter Parker series that came out. And that does make me wonder, like, maybe he said everything he wanted to with the character. I know when he didn't take over Fantastic Four, one of the things they went to was the fact that, like, he did the two-in-one, so he felt like he told his Fantastic Four story would that be the case? You know, part of this too is not just how good is the fit. The other part is, do they have a story they want to tell for the character? Does Chip Zdarsky have that? Of course, I have no idea. I did like his Peter Parker run. That I think it ran like maybe 20 issues or so. I don't remember off the top of my head, but it was solid. I really like the annual he did with J. Jonah Jameson that kind of focused on the outside of Peter Parker's world, which I think is something a writer definitely needs to do, is not just get Peter right, but get the entire kind of Peter Parker family, extended family, right down as well, and make them just as much as the focus or a part of the focus. Spider-Man, out of all of Marvel titles, is a family book. I'd argue even more than Fantastic Four, because of the largeness of the family, from Aunt May to Mary Jane and other individuals that he's gone out with, or the community around him. Spider-Man has like a gigantic group of players within his world, and being able to get those characters right and write to those characters is just as important as getting Peter Parker right, and we've seen Chip Zdarsky do that. So I think he'd be good for the title as well. He wouldn't be my first choice because, again, we saw him write the character. I would like to see someone new take on the character and see what they could do with it. I'm going to talk about who would be my first choice, actually, to take over the character of Spider-Man. At least my first realistic choice. The person I think makes the most sense, is it would do a good job with the character, and has proven herself throughout the world of Marvel in the titles that she's worked on, and that's Kelly Thompson, who right now to me is writing one of Marvel's best books, if not Marvel's best book, with Black Widow. And what I would do if I was Marvel, similar to me mentioning taking the Al Ewing, Joe Bennett, and putting them on Immortal Hulk, if you did the same thing with Black Widow, because that is a series that could potentially end within the next few issues or so, by the time Nick Spencer's off Amazing Spider-Man, take that creative team and just put them on Spider-Man, and I think you would have a fantastic book. Now that's, of course, easier said than done, but I've been so impressed with the success of that book on a storytelling perspective, both artistically, characters, everything is there. Even though Adam Hughes on covers that entire group, it was recently nominated for an Eisner, and there's a reason why it's definitely deserving. So let's take that momentum that you're going to get from that book, and I think you'd probably get more momentum once the movie comes out and people are like, hey, I want to read more Black Widow. There's not a lot of great Black Widow series to choose from. You could say, hey, check this out, and guess what? This team is now doing Spider-Man, the most popular character of all time. You love this book? Well, you can get right into Spider-Man right after this and enjoy it just as well. To me, that makes the most sense, both financially, both quality-wise. It all kind of lines up there for you. So I think Marvel would be in their best interest and the best interest of the fans to take Kelly Thompson and that team and put them on Spider-Man. Now, if it wasn't that entire creative team, if it was just Kelly Thompson, I would be for that as well. And again, I think she really gets personal relationships. Look at Black Widow, for example. She created a personal relationship, a family with her, and only in the first few issues, I think it really added a lot of depth to that character. Other relationships, I felt like she's been really strong on. Even the back and forth between characters like Hawkeye and Winter Soldier, or Hawkeye and Kate Bishop, other Hawkeye, how she's able to kind of get that dynamic where they're both people that have that snarky personality but can also be badass at the same time. That to me fits Spider-Man, right? He's snarky, but you mess with Spider-Man, he can be a badass. And that's one thing I forgot to mention with Chip Zdarsky, is that Chip Zdarsky's also written a really scary Spider-Man in the pages of Daredevil. Like when he's confronting Daredevil, it put him in perspective just how much of a badass Spider-Man can be when he's up against your street level individuals, because man can be a monster. But ultimately, if you ask me who is the best person to put on Spider-Man right now, who would be the creator that you would say would give you the best chance of success, both financially and critically and quality-wise? It would be Kelly Thompson. I think it makes the most sense. She's written the best Captain Marvel run we've gotten in forever, the best Black Widow run we've gotten forever. I loved her West Coast Adventures. I just think there's a lot there. And the fact that we haven't really had a female writer on Amazing Spider-Man in, I don't know, ever. Will it happen? Who knows? But again, there are other names that may also work out for the title. Let's get to some more of those as well. A name that wouldn't surprise me but wouldn't excite me would be someone like Charles Soule. Charles Soule is working a lot right now with the Star Wars books. He's written a lot of the Star Wars books and kind of leading this gigantic multi-issue crossover with the bounty hunters going on right now. And he's done a lot of work at the same time, doing Daredevil and things like that. So he is used to that type of schedule. So I could see him taking over a character like Spider-Man. Now, Charles Soule, when I read his stuff, I usually like it. It's usually pretty good. I've never read a Charles Soule book and was amazed about what he had put on the page, but I've never read one and was utterly disgusted about what he put on the page either. So I could also see that him being like a bridge to someone else. Like, you know, Nick Spencer's off the book. We need someone to fill in for an arc or two, and then we're going to get our new big name writer. I could definitely see that. He definitely sees like a accompanying band per se. You know, he was a lawyer before he came a comic book writer, which is a weird path to choose, but it did kind of work out when he took over Daredevil, and a lot of the things that he set up are still there, like Mayor Fisk, that came from his run. So would he be able to kind of bring that back into Spider-Man? Again, he's written, you know, pretty much every Marvel character you could think of. Maybe, like I said, I think he'd be a name that makes sense. I think he'd be a name that like you can depend on, but is he going to be a name that will bring in people that maybe drop the book or aren't liking it right now or get people excited? I don't necessarily think so. So again, I think if anything, he'd be a temporary fix until they get a more long-term solution. You also have to consider one of Marvel's biggest writers still being Jason Aaron. Of course, he had his epic Thor run, and then he came on to Avengers, which has left a lot to be desired, but I do feel like overall the Heroes Reborn event, whatever you want to call it, has been generally positively received. And I think Jason Aaron is a great writer in the right circumstance. His Avengers run didn't work for me, but I love his Thor run. Southern Bastards, to me, is a fantastic book. Scalped, he's capable of great things. He's capable of writing a lot of titles at the same time, and minus any stuff that takes forever to come out. But again, he's writing Avengers, he's written Thor. Could he take over a character like Spider-Man? Marvel likes to have, you know, certain names, kind of put them on different books. And we're seeing that how Venom switched over, and, you know, we're taking the Venom team and putting them on Hulk, and then Hulk and putting them on Venom. Would this happen here, where you take, you know, Nick Spencer off the Spider-Man line, put him on Avengers, and put Jason Aaron off Avengers and put him on Spider-Man? Who knows? I do think, though, he's a name you have to consider because he is one of the most prolific writers right now in Marvel. He might have one of the longest, you know, stays in the company. You know, he's been there quite some time. You know, he was the kind of young upstart. Now he's been the aging veteran, but I could see him taking over the book. I think a change is needed for Jason Aaron right now because the Avengers book is just not clicking with a lot of people, myself included. But maybe going over to something like Spider-Man could work. But my only hesitation is the fact that, again, I don't know if they would want to put him on that book. And we also haven't heard him coming off of the Avengers as of right now because we have the World War She-Hulk coming out. Maybe that wouldn't happen, but I don't know. I do think it's a name that you at least have to think about when you're looking at the landscape of Marvel right now. When you think of Spider-Man, one of the first things you think about is his dialogue, his quippy personality, the guy who makes jokes in situations where you normally don't have jokes. So who's a writer that is really known for strong dialogue? And one that comes to mind that's currently working a lot with Marvel is Matthew Rosenberg. And Matthew Rosenberg is doing some DC stuff right now, too, here and there. He's doing the Grifter storyline for the one Batman anthology. But I think he would do wonders with the character. I think he's one of Marvel's, like, untapped resources right now, and he's done really good series like Hawkeye Freefall, which I loved, but unfortunately I don't know why it didn't get the acclaim, or people didn't necessarily garner to it as much as I did. I really love that book, but maybe, you know, when you have a failure like that, I don't want to call it a failure, but when you have a book that wasn't as successful as it should have been, would that make it hesitant to put him on a character like Spider-Man? I hope not, because I think sometimes in a way that can help boost up that book. Like if people read his work on Spider-Man and dig it, be wondering like, oh, what else did he did? And like, hey, Chris, check out this Hawkeye Freefall series as well. It's good. If you like that, you'll like this. Maybe, I don't know. I do put him on a little less likely than some of the other names that have on the list, but I think if you give him like a Spider-Man one-off series, like the nonstop Spider-Man that we've had, or the Peter Parker Spider-Man series that's away from the main book, I think that'd be cool just to see what he can do with the character. Now, when I was talking about Jason Aaron, I mentioned you have a writer who's been long established, really with fans, with Marvel, but I think with Spider-Man, or a character like Batman, or your big names, it makes the most sense to get that writer who's on the precipice of becoming the next big thing, because if you get them to work on Spider-Man, you can take that name that is like, you know, loved by certain people and bring them into the next stratosphere, and then you have another name you can put out on other books in the future. For example, Tom King. You know, Tom King, he was well regarded for books like Vision and Sheriffs of Babylon, but he wasn't a name that would sell books at that time. A lot of his books barely each buy without getting canceled. But people saw that he had talent and put him on Batman. And say what you will about his run on Batman, but he's now a name that you put on a book and you're going to get attention for it, which sometimes equates to sales, or sometimes it equates to long-term sales, like, you know, his run on Mr. Miracle, which is going to be one of those books that sells in trade forever. So who's a writer right now for Marvel that is on the precipice of kind of breaking out to become the next big thing. And there's a few, but one of the ones that comes to mind first is Jed MacKay, who's done a lot of work recently with Black Cat. He also did the Taskmaster series, and those books, were so much better than they had any right being. And to me, that's often a good sign of a writer that you need to give more responsibility or bigger titles. The books that shouldn't do well, people can take the most popular character in the world and tell a good story. It's another thing to take a character like Taskmaster, who I don't know if he's ever had a miniseries that was worth anyone's attention, and write a good book with it. To me, that just shows you the strength of a writer. It doesn't matter what character you give them, they're able to give good content. And that was the case with Jed MacKay and his creative team with Taskmaster and Black Cat. So I think that would be another good choice as well. Again, he's not a name that's going to get a lot of general fans' attention as much, but he may be someone that does a good job with the book. People like what he does, and they go back and check out some of his earlier work as well. And the fact he's worked on characters like Black Cat, who are in the, the universe of Spider-Man, because he has such a gigantic universe. It's not a blind transition. He's at least had some familiarity with that world, at least a little bit. So I think Jed MacKay would also be a good choice. Those are the main writers I think are most likely to take over the book. There may be some others I didn't mention, but the ones at least I felt like I had the most to say about. Now I wanted to talk about some writers that probably have less likely of a chance to take over the character, but there's reasons maybe that Marvel should look their way. And the first being Rainbow Warre, who is currently working on the Runaways book, which is a highly underrated book. Runaways was a very popular book when Brian K. Vaughan was working on it. It kind of went away. There's been some installments here and there. Some is not as good. Right now, Runaways is as good as it's ever been, largely due to Rainbow Warre, who's also not just a name that people know in the superhero world. She has written a lot of prose novels as well, and other YA and general graphic novels. So she's a very popular author outside of just your Marvel and DC world. So you put a name like that within a character like Spider-Man, and maybe you get some people that don't typically read the character of Spider-Man checking it out. And again, I think she'd be able to focus in a lot on the more dramatic aspects of the character, the more personal pieces of the character as well. And I think that is Spider-Man's biggest strength as a character, are those pieces, are those elements of him and his relationship with Mary Jane, his relationship with other characters, his relationship with Aunt May. Those are what make him relatable. And if there's anything Rainbow Warre can do as a writer, is get characters that you can relate to and perhaps create new characters. So again, I don't know necessarily if she'd want to have the time commitment needed to take over a character like Amazing Spider-Man, but I think it could be a fun choice. It could be kind of cool to see how that works out. So now I want to talk about a writer that I feel like is one of the most underrated writers all for comics, and that's David F. Walker. And David F. Walker is maybe a name you may not know, but he's done a lot of stuff that you should know, including his run on Power Man and Iron Fist with Sanford Green, and that was such a fantastic run. Also his run on Nighthawk, which was, again, one that was severely underrated. He's done a lot of work for DC as well. If you heard of the character Naomi, what is often left out of the conversation is the fact that David F. Walker was also a co-writer on that book, and I think brought a lot to that series in general. He's also a co-writer on the multi-nominated for Eisner's title, Bitter Root. He comes with a pretty big pedigree, but when people talk about the best writers out there, his name doesn't get mentioned. And I think he, again, is very versatile in his style. You look at Bitter Root, Naomi even did a really good annual for Cable and Deadpool, and as a fan of that original series, I thought he nailed those characters perfectly. He's a person that I think can really write towards the characters that he's portraying. Like you don't even hear his voice because you're hearing the character's voice. And again, when you have a character like Spider-Man, that makes the most sense. So I'd love to see David F. Walker take over the book. I think it's extremely unlikely because, unfortunately, when you look at his Marvel work, a lot of it didn't get the sales that they deserved. And unfortunately, when it comes down to these decisions, it's business first. But if any of the titles I talked about are ones that interest you, definitely check them out. They are for sure worth your time and money. And this is a name I think is a little bit more likely because he does do a lot of work for Marvel, and that's Scotty Young. Now, Scotty Young right now has, I think, again, one of Marvel's best books with Strange Adventures. And him, and again, taking a creative team and just putting them on a character, taking Scotty Young and Humberto Ramos, who are doing wonders with Strange Adventures, and putting them on Spider-Man, I think would be kind of cool. I mean, Humberto Ramos has done a lot of Spider-Man, so it wouldn't be new for him. The downside is I kind of like them where they're at with Strange Adventures because I really love that book. But I do think, again, humor-wise, Scotty Young, he can hit that. He can write hard. Just check out Middle Rest. He's a very versatile writer who I think is growing more and more as a strong writer. Of course, came in because of his art. in his first, my first experience with his work was actually him doing covers for Cable and Deadpool, and then he's known for his more cartoony style. But I think as a writer, he has shown that he can kind of write all different types of stuff. He's done YA stuff, like the Bully Wars stuff. Middle West, I think, is, I wouldn't even call it a YA title. It's just a really good human drama story that deals with fantasy elements. And now, same thing with Strange Academy. He, I think, would be a really good fit for something like that of Spider-Man. And I do think he has a lot of fans out there, per se. I wouldn't necessarily think that you would want him to do the art for the book, but again, that's where I think having Roberto Ramos would be fantastic, because, you know, getting a creative teams that are familiar with one another. Again, it would probably not be able to be a bi-weekly book, which is the reason why, or bi-monthly, however you want to say it, which would be the reason why I think it'd be unlikely, but I think it could lead to good things. The time commitment is another reason why I think this author probably would not take over the character, but I'd love to see him try, and that's Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's currently ending, or just ended his run on Black Panther, and now he's continuing running Captain America. And I like to see what he would do with a character like Spider-Man. I know his stuff tends to be pretty lofty for some people, like his Black Panther run. It kind of got lost in itself a little bit, but he is very ambitious with his style. I think he's becoming a better and better comic book writer than when he first started. You see a character like Spider-Man would be unlike anything he's written quite yet. I mean, Captain America has a very strong political piece to it, which makes sense. Would he inject that within Spider-Man, which has it in the past, but not necessarily what you think of first when you think of Spider-Man? But I do think that'd be kind of cool. Just, I don't know if he could do it. He's a strong enough writer, and just in general, I would think it could work. Would he have any interest? I don't know, but I'm just curious to see, like, sometimes contrasting styles can yield to something that's really great, and maybe that would be the case for Spider-Man and Ta-Nehisi Coates taking over the character. I don't know, but it just was a name that I felt like he's firmly established with the world of Marvel. He's been doing a lot of his own kind of thing, and would that work with a character like Spider-Man? I'd be in favor of just trying it and see how it works out. Maybe it's an epic failure, but I think it'd be a failure that's at least interesting to witness. I also felt it would be kind of wrong not to include this name, and that being Saladin Ahmad, because he's currently working with Miles Morales right now in that book. So would it make sense to say, hey, you're working on one Spider-Man character, let's switch over to the other Spider-Man book? Maybe he just kind of likes being where he's in right now. You know, he has, I think nearly 26 issues within Miles Morales, which is a lot to be in, but also shows that he can keep up with that type of schedule. I love a lot of his independent stuff, like Abbott, for example. I've not loved everything about Miles Morales, but I actually thought the way he's handling the Clone Saga was actually so much better than I ever thought it would be. I was like, why would you bring that back? That storyline people really have a distaste for, and the way they're approaching it, I think it makes sense, and takes something that shouldn't be good and making it much better than it is. So again, that to me is a sign of a good writer. Maybe that would work with a character like Peter Parker. Does he have any interest? Again, I don't know, but I do think, like, he clearly has been working with Wallcrawlers in the past, so, you know, it wouldn't be like it was breaking brand new ground for him to work on the book. Another writer I see pop up a lot is Ram V, and it makes a lot of sense because he's a really good writer. I love the Savage Shores, Blue and Green from last year, his Swamp Thing run. He's going to be co-writing Venom with Al Ewing, so, you know, he has a pedigree that would make you think that he would be able to be successful with a character like Spider-Man for sure. My thought is, though, that Marvel is usually pretty hesitant to take a writer, take a creator they have not worked to a great extent and put on Spider-Man. They used, like, Dan Slott, for example. Like, he did some of their work with She-Hulk and things like that, and he was part of the team that was, like, what, you had like 3 people working on Spider-Man at the same time when they're making that transition to eventually be the person that they took over the title in general, in large part because he had deadlines and he was able to take up and kind of be there despite the fact that you had a book that was shipped as much as it was. And, you know, I could see them being a little hesitant to put on Ram V on the book right now, but maybe if Venom does turn out to be as good as we hope it is, maybe that will change down the line, or maybe they give him some more and more work. I do think Ram V is going to be a writer we see much more of, not less, in the upcoming years, and I do think that he's a writer that if you like good comics, you should definitely check out. You know, like I mentioned, those books, The Savage Shores, Blue and Green last year, his Swamp Thing run right now. He's writing on Catwoman. That's been really strong. So I do think that, you know, when you look at the most consistent writers in comics right now, his name is right there, so it wouldn't make sense. I just think that Marvel tends to be a little protective of characters, which you can kind of get, which makes me think it's not likely to happen, at least this time. The last group of writers are ones I think have zero to no chance of taking over the title, but I think it'd be kind of cool at least to see how things go, starting with Gail Simone, right? And Gail Simone, I feel like she's not written a lot of consistent stuff in the world of the big two in some time. She had the Domino book for Marvel not too long ago, but that kind of came and went. She's not really been on a big name book like this for some time, but I do think she has a lot of fans. I mean, she has a huge social presence as well, and that's part of it. So I do think you put Gail Simone on Spider-Man, that's going to get a lot of attention, and I do think, you know, she's been a very accomplished writer in her own right. I think her style makes a lot of sense to fit a character like Spider-Man. So if I was Marvel, I would at least, you know, see how it would work out, or at least seeing if it'd be something she was interested in. She had her current schedule, what she's been working on, maybe that's not something that would happen, but I don't know, we would be interested to see if that would be something Marvel would be interested in doing, or maybe if she'd have any interest in doing at all. I would also love to see a writer-artist take over the character of Spider-Man. Now, someone like Joelle Jones, for example, who's currently writing and drawing the Wonder Girl series. Again, I think it's unlikely because of the schedule you need for Spider-Man. There's no one who could write and draw Spider-Man when it's coming out twice a month. It'd be impossible unless you like have some sort of time machine or something like that. It'd be kind of cool to see Joelle Jones maybe even just draw Spider-Man. I'd love to see it. She's one of my favorite current artists. Again, but he's currently kind of focused in with her DC work, making it unlikely. Another artist, though, I think would be just as cool would be writer-artist Daniel Warren Johnson, who's currently working on DAREDEVIL for Marvel. Again, I think it'd be unlikely impossible considering the schedule, and the fact that, again, he's a name that has not done a lot with Marvel as of late. DAREDEVIL being the first thing, and I think he does work best when he can kind of not have to deal with all the other continuity stuff that's a completely other monster, right? It's not just about being able to write good stories, it's being able to fit your stories into this ever-changing events that happen, because if there's an event, usually that's going to be incorporating Spider-Man in some way, and that's an entirely different talent outside of just being able to write. You know, that's the other thing people don't think about. It's not just about being a good creator, it's dealing with all the kind of business aspect of it as well, and usually with that you need experience, which some of these creators don't have. But I would love to see at least Daniel Warren Johnson take on the character of Spider-Man in some way, because I think that would look fantastic, especially with his ability to draw scale. Putting Spider-Man into the, you know, New York City with him drawing it, I think would yield nothing but, you know, amazing results in the long run. Again, extremely impossible for it to happen, but someone can dream. Recently, Patrick Gleason has been doing a lot of art for Spider-Man. He had, you know, of course, set the world on fire with a Spider-Man cover at the end of 2020. And it had me thinking of some of his best work has been with Peter Tomasi, especially the run on Superman Rebirth, which is one of the best Superman titles in some time. And that, again, is another book that focused on a lot of family. That was the central focus of that. And considering we've been talking about how Spider-Man and family go hand in hand, why not take that creative team again and put them on Spider-Man? Would it work? I guess like that'd be something that would excite me, but maybe not your general fan, so that's why it makes me think it's unlikely. But I do think I'd love to see them partner again, because I do think when they're working together, they tend to do their best work. But again, I don't think that Peter Tomasi is a name that's going to jump off the page for a lot of people, which is something that Marvel likes to do. You know, he's a pretty established creator at this point. I don't think this would bring him into the new echelon. I don't think this would bring in new writers. It'd probably yield a good product, but not one that's going to, you know, be a huge splash for the world of Spider-Man, which makes me think it's unlikely for it to happen. Tamaki's another name I feel like that belongs in these types of conversations. She's a fantastic writer. I do tend to love her stuff more so outside of her Marvel and DC work, for example. Wasn't too keen on her work with Wonder Woman, but at the same time, I have been enjoying her work on Detective Comics, of course, which would make her working with Marvel on Amazing Spider-Man probably impossible. She did do a lot of work with Marvel with their Women's Month anthology book. She had a lot of stories in that, which made me want to bring up the name, because she's done a lot of work with Marvel as of late. Again, though, you're not going to be able to take the writer who's doing Detective Comics and bring them over to Spider-Man without them having to cancel one without the other. But I do think that she would be able to do well with the character. I'd be interested in seeing how she takes on Spider-Man's world. I think it's unlikely because, again, she's working with detectives, so I doubt they even would bring that into conversation. But I do think she's another name that if Marvel or DC or smart, will give more and more opportunities for some of these characters and give her the room to kind of do her own thing rather than trying to fit her into like an editorial box, which I think tends to happen, especially for creators that are coming outside of the world of your monthly floppy types of work. There are certain names when these come up that I always bring up that I think would be a good idea but I think are extremely unlikely, probably will never happen. And one of those names is Mark Russell. And when it came to Batman, I'm like, I want to see Mark Russell do Batman. When it came to Superman, I'm like, I want to see Mark Russell do Superman. Now when it's Spider-Man, I want to see Mark Russell, right, for Spider-Man. You know, Mark Russell, of course, wrote the Flintstones. He's done Billionaire Island, Second Coming. He's done some Marvel work. He did a Marvel Snapshot issue last year on Captain America. He's currently working on Fantastic Four Life Story, again, which makes me think it's unlikely they would put him on a huge book like Amazing Spider-Man right now. The thing is that Mark Russell's like kind of one of those comedians where you have a comedian that other comedians love, but just the general public doesn't appreciate nearly as much. And I feel that's the case with Mark Russell. A lot of people love his work. It's been well accomplished and critically acclaimed, award-winning, award-nominated, like the Flintstones and other books. But unfortunately, a lot of his books don't necessarily get the sales they deserve. I do think he would do a great job on Spider-Man, and for people thinking that his work always has to have a comedic tilt to it, I'd say check out his Red Sonja run, which is a fantastic run into that character that just recently ended. Even did Judge Dredd, which I think is a bit of an underrated miniseries. I think he's really grown as a writer with the different titles he has been able to take on. But again, I don't think he's a name that has the cachet that he should have based upon the output he's been able to make. Like, his books have been fantastic, critically acclaimed, but when it comes to sales, not quite there. I'd love to see it. I'd love to see him get more Marvel stuff. I like that he is giving more Marvel stuff, like that Fantastic Four Life Story. If that's successful, maybe he'll get some more and more things, but I don't think it will be happening at least this round. Lastly, for my list, I have Raina Telgemeier, mainly because she is the most popular writer, arguably right now, in the world of comics. Her books like Smile and Guts sell millions upon millions of comics. Of course, she's firmly within that YA world right now. In a lot of ways, she was the person that helped kind of pave that road for a lot of people. And she may not be a name that like your Wednesday Warriors know, but you go to a middle school, they know who she is, and we're going to love her books based upon the way that sales look at the moment. Now, if I'm Marvel, I'm at least trying to make that call. I have no idea if she had any interest whatsoever to write a superhero story. She doesn't need to. I mean, she of course is able to do her own thing, and she's been very successful at that. But I think that, again, would be something that would be worth at least trying. You know, I think in a lot of ways, comics are not written to kids for Marvel and DC nearly as much as they were when I first started reading books. And someone like Raina Telgemeier could change that. I mean, right now, YA books greatly outsell superhero titles. And if I'm Marvel, if knowing that, you know, you're owned by Disney, they want you to go where the money is. It makes a lot of sense. And she's, again, ultimately a great writer. A lot of that it's coming from a more personal place, though. But so would it work when you have a superhero character? And it could. You can take those personal experiences and just put them through the lens of a character like Peter Parker, who's probably, you know, popular in a lot of ways because of the way people relate to him. So again, that's why I think it would make a cool attempt. I think I'd love to see it. It'd get a lot of attention for sure. It would hopefully maybe even bring in, you know, kids into the comic book shop on Wednesdays that aren't normally doing that. Would it happen? Like I said, I think it's extremely unlikely. One, I don't think she probably has any interest. She doesn't necessarily need any interest. And I think maybe some Marvel writers would be a little hesitant because they're like, hey, she writes kids books, not Spider-Man, waiting for her to write for Marvel in DC in some way. Like, if I'm Marvel or DC, I'm at least giving her, even if it's just like a original graphic novel or something like that that's in her own little world, just to see how things go. How does that sell? I think, you know, at this time, Marvel needs her more than she needs Marvel. Marvel is getting a partnership with Scholastic, so it does make sense. You can kind of continue that partnership in a new way. It's weird, though, because, you know, Raina Telgemeier sells $1 trillion comics, but there's a lot of comic fans that probably don't even know who she is because, you know, her books are geared to a different audience, and you do have a pretty segregated comic book community right now in the sense of you have your YA books and you have your superhero books, and rarely do they cross paths. And I think that in order for them to even grow or sustain even more, it makes a lot of sense for that separation to kind of come together more and more. Because if you want your brand, you want these characters to sustain for the long haul, well, you need to replace those with new readers, readers who are going to be your readers 10, 20 years down the line when your other readers are too old or not capable of reading comics. So why not take this as an opportunity to get one of the biggest names in comics, really all of literature right now, and put on one of the biggest characters of all time and see how things go. Is it likely? Again, extremely unlikely, but hey, I figured I'd at least bring the name out because it makes a lot of sense. So yeah, I'd be interested in seeing what our writers or creators you would love to see on the character of Spider-Man. Who do you think makes the most sense? who is a long shot you'd like to see in the book that you think is extremely unlikely, but it would be kind of cool to see how it turns out. I give you, of course, a lot of names that I came up with. There's a ton of other names. I'm sure I, of course, wanted to keep this under 4 hours, but I know there are a ton of comic book channels out there. I appreciate you being patient with me as I try to get everything that figure out in the next few weeks, but hopefully it'll be back to normal relatively soon. For now, just remember that comics are for everyone. The key is finding the right one. Until next time, keep reading.